Welcome to FO Exclusive. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me is Glenn Carle, a retired CIA officer, the author of The Interrogator, and a fantastic geopolitical analyst. In the next hour, the two of us, the Rashput and the Wasp, will make sense of the three most important developments of the month. In short, as I cheekily say, and Glenn always feels uncomfortable about it, we will make sense of the world. Our top three choices for June are: 1, energy, commodity, and food shock from the Russia-Ukraine war. Following on from that, our second choice is prospects of global economic slowdown. And third is democracy, US and France, both of which saw interesting developments this week. And Peter Isaacson, our Chief Strategy Officer, our comrade in arms, wrote a fantastic piece saying and arguing that perhaps it might be the beginning of the end of the Fifth Republic. Well, without further ado, Glenn, I'll let you continue.
Okay, always giving me the easy tasks. So we're going to try to connect the three topics, because of course everything is interrelated, as we know, and we'll try to sensibly show how one flows to the other. So the energy, commodity, the food shock issue, of course, directly affecting the economies of the world, and all of this playing out in the context of, I think, frankly, even larger tectonic groans and shifts of advanced societies in particular, and how these changes are affecting democracy. It's the theme that some of you may, at this point, have recognized as dearest to my heart, but we'll get to that in a bit. So, no surprise to anyone, oil prices continue to increase for two reasons. The specific reason, two main reasons. The specific reason, of course, is the Ukraine war, which has cut off to the world two critically important suppliers. One, because the country is being destroyed and embargoed, quarantined by the Russian Navy, that's Ukraine, and then two, the Russians, because of the efforts of NATO states in particular, European Western states, to stop Russia's oil exports with moderate to less than moderate success, but still with effect. In addition, we learned that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which seem to be the two countries with capacity to increase their production levels of oil to ease the supply demand and then put some softening on the price rises, claim that they might not be able to raise the prices as much, the production as much as we had hoped, or as one hopes. And even if they can, they might simply be lying, because they have their own interests in nice high prices, and aren't particularly in harmony with the U.S. on political issues at the moment. So it looks like oil prices are going to stay high for quite some time, which will have starting to have significant effects on growth rates, and then after that on inflation and on unemployment in the advanced democracies, and then in all of them.
Well, as if the price of oil wasn't enough, the other big issue is the prices of natural gas are rising, and Bloomberg tells us that Europe is struggling to fill the Russian supply gap. Now, what is going on in Europe? Well, there are requirements for energy, especially over winter, and Europe has been particularly reliant on Russian energy over the last few years. Nord Stream 1, of course, was a key factor for German industry and, of course, heating of German homes over winter. Nord Stream 2 has now been spiked. Peter, another Peter, who is a German MP, interviewed with us, and he is one of the great votaries of transatlantic partnership. He's from the CDU, and he took the stand that the pain is worth it because we cannot rely on Russia. However, buyers have found it more difficult to replace Russian gas from elsewhere. As some of you might know, that flows through a major route of the EU were cut by 60% earlier this month. Now, Germany is warning of rationing. The EU Energy Commissioner, Kadri Simpson, has said, well, there may not be enough supply worldwide to fully replace Russian flows. In fact, the German economy minister, Robert Habeck, has warned of a supply crisis in one member state leading to an economic crisis in another. Full storages, as we know, are critical for Europe to get through winter when demand for heating peaks. Stock levels are currently more than half full, but still below the average of the last 5 years. So a cutoff in Russian supplies could mean in EU inventories are less than 75% by November 1. I mean, the target is 80%, so 5% here and there, not so much. But the big trouble for Europe, and in particular Germany, is it's forcing industries to cut demand. And it's putting further pressure on a European economy that is struggling with surging inflation and meager growth. Remember, both the EU and the US had a financial crisis in 2007, 2008. That led to a stimulus, that led to quantitative easing. And quantitative easing has been practiced only once before by Japan. So the jury is still out what it leads to. That leads to asset price bubbles. And that arguably we can already see in certain markets, the frothiness of certain markets. And as if that was not enough, that was followed by a pandemic, and that led to massive fiscal spending. So government spent a ton. And so you had a massive monetary stimulus followed by a massive fiscal stimulus. And now you're seeing a supply side shock. And so that supply side shock could be pretty serious. Glenn, you were going to talk about the G7 price gap plan as to how to fund this. And before you do so, very quickly, last month we covered the food crisis. And so very quickly, that food crisis still continues. Very quick take on you, as you know, that when it comes to wheat, when it comes to corn, when it comes to oilseeds, we went through this last month. Russia and Ukraine are major suppliers, in fact, a fourth of world wheat. All of North Africa pretty much depends on Russia or Russian or Ukrainian wheat, all the way from Lebanon to Tunisia. And so all those countries are in crisis. Let's see if Lebanon remains as a country, given the extreme stress it'll go under. It has storage capacity of only a month after the big explosion a couple of years ago, if I remember correctly. Egypt, of course, gets most of its calories from wheat, and so on and so forth. And we can wash down through sub-Saharan Africa, which is facing a major debt crisis. So the inflation triggered by oil, and of course, the double whammy in terms of food inflation, because inflation, high oil prices also mean higher food prices, first in production and then in distribution.
And there's 40% of the cost of food is the cost of energy. I think that's the figure.
Yeah. So we know that commodities all the recent days, they've come down a bit, and Barron says this may be a sign of a global recession because demand has come down. But commodities have also taken a hit. Lest we forget, 25% of nickel comes from Russia. Similarly, when it comes to aluminium, when it comes to uranium, when it comes to copper, all of these, Russia is a big exporter. And so given the way how globalization has led to very intricate and very interconnected supply chains, that supply side shock that we are seeing is only now washing through. And so I'll stop now and hand it over to Glenn to talk about the G7 price. I'm tripping over right now.
Cap plan.
Price gap plan. Yeah.
Before that, though, I think history is unfortunately has some relatively depressing lessons to offer us that are relevant in the current context. I think the European Union has, I've been impressed by their plan to wean the continent from Russian oil and gas. But under the best case, it will take several years. In the best case, almost, the ideal is never attained. So that's unlikely to occur. And that assumes, or that includes the construction of a number of liquefied natural gas terminals in various places in Europe, in particular more in Germany. Under the best case, they take a couple of years, if not several, to construct. Similarly, the United States has the reserves of natural gas that it can export, and there are substantial resources and attention being now focused on ramping up the production capabilities. Now that has global climate warming ramifications, which I'll leave aside, which are quite consequential, and our leaders need to take into account as they decide how to address this crisis. But under the best case, we're talking several years. Great Britain in the 1930s wasn't completely clueless about the rise of Hitler, Prime Minister Chamberlain notwithstanding, and started to retool its economy and its military to increase the military forces and capabilities and production levels. But it took something like 4 years, if not more, to reach what you could call full production focus and levels of the British economy for a war economy, war production. The United States did the same thing, but was lagging by a number of years. It took from the United States started to change its economy to address military requirements in the late 1930s. But it wasn't really until 1943 or 44 that production levels had exploded dramatically. So under the best case, if everything were to go right, we're speaking about a several-year lag to build liquid natural gas facilities, increase production levels, and then get supplies starting to come. So I see significant economic consequences of the war in Ukraine and of the gas embargoes and freezes by Russia, by the EU, is inevitable. Now, what to do about this? So President Biden, it seems, has come up with a plan, or if not he, the leaders of the G7 collectively have. I don't know if the U.S. can claim ownership, but I think that's the case, to try to set the limit on the price of Russian oil globally, which would then protect, to some extent, the purchasing economies, largely European, from the consequences of the war, while not forbidding them during this transitional period to buy oil or elsewhere in the world, other countries. But as my understanding of economics extends, oil is a fungible commodity. And if I don't buy it, somebody else will. India, as we know, at least we know that India has increased its levels, but the increase, the facts are quite significant. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, India was purchasing 100,000 barrels of oil per day from Russia. It's now 1 million barrels per day. China, I don't know the statistics, but it's a similar continuation and increase. So I don't actually see this this plan as very likely to work. And then just to end, as the larger consequence for that Atul touched upon, it's not just oil, but it's the global economy and actual risk of starvation in numerous countries in the world, because there are literally less grains available to the point of starvation of some countries levels, and the cost of producing food elsewhere where it is available is, as I say, I think it's about 40% of the cost of choose your foodstuff is the energy required to produce it. So I see no way for us to avoid substantial delays in responding and consequences from the shocks, and probably a global economic, at least slowdown, rise in inflation, lowering of the GDP rates, if not recessions. And I'll let Atul explore that for a moment.
Yeah, well, yesterday the World Bank said that the world is entering a protracted period of feeble growth and elevated inflation. In January, which is not so long ago, it had predicted growth of 4.1%. Now it has cut global growth forecasts to 2.9% for 2022. And more importantly, it has said many countries are likely to face recession. It has not talked as much about the ticking debt time bomb, which a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and of course, not just sub-Saharan Africa, but elsewhere, the Sri Lankan economic meltdown is a case in point. Obviously, this is not all because of this supply shock. There were factors that led up to it, but the supply shock basically...
China too, perhaps more than anywhere.
Sorry?
China too, and perhaps more than anywhere. Certainly more.
Yeah, I'll get to that. You're absolutely right, because a big driver of economic growth is China. And if China slows down, then we are facing a global slowdown. But onto that. The Bank of International Settlements, BIS, it's an interesting organization because it does have a global macro view, and it has issued a statement saying that countries must make decisive rate hikes to prevent inflation from getting out of control and from becoming something worse. And that something worse is economic slowdown and possibly stagflation. Central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, have already begun moves. The Fed's rate hike has seen the dollar rise to highs not seen in 2 decades. Now, in its flagship annual economic report 2022, BIS says the global economy risks entering a new era of high inflation. And while it maintains that a 1970s style stagflation is unlikely because of improved monetary policy and macroprudential frameworks and less reliance on energy, but it warns that the current backdrop of financial vulnerabilities, high debt, and overvalued asset prices could magnify any economic slowdown. I'll let Glenn talk more about the Federal Reserve and Congressional Budget Office, and he'll bring the American view.
The BIS, I have tremendous respect for. I think is a bit more pessimistic. I'm happy if that characterization is correct. A bit more pessimistic than some of the assessments that I've been reading, particularly from U.S. sources like the Congressional Budget Office and the Federal Reserve Board. I haven't had time in the last few days because I was traveling to check what the OECD has to say, which I respect quite a bit, perhaps because I'm a homer. I worked there as my first job after college. But in any event, even the Federal Reserve, it's taken various models of assessing the economy and to see whether the direction of inflation and unemployment and GDP and so on. And it indicates, their models indicate up to a 67% chance of recession in the United States. Now, the Congressional Budget office, which is an honor, a respected institution, in contrast, is predicting a successful decline in inflation in the United States and globally, and continued GDP growth, although slowing, but nonetheless continuing for the next 3 years. I am not, I don't work at the OECD anymore. I didn't spend my career in this, but the economics I learned, which is classic, international economics, it pretty well agrees with the Fed. If you increase the money supply, which has happened dramatically in the United States through quantitative easing, through monetary policy, and through fiscal policy, with both of the tools, with huge bills allocating a huge percentage of the economy in relative terms to spending programs, you will have a rise in inflation. If you have low unemployment, as we do, we have historically low unemployment, you will have a price pressure on wages. These are almost unavoidable consequences of, in some ways, economic success in the case of low unemployment. And if you have inflation, the response then, almost the only tool is that you either cut spending, which will increase unemployment, or you raise interest rates, which is happening. And the rises, although to an absolute level in historical terms are not especially high, they're the highest since I was a graduate student studying economics, which is 45 years ago. So I see no way to avoid what we are experiencing. I don't necessarily think we will slide into a period of permanent high inflation, but the hardest task of any economic policymaker is to cut inflation without cutting economic growth and throwing the economy into a recession. And since all of our data looks backwards, and since it takes 18 months on average, it depends on the interest rate rise we're talking about. There are different kinds of interest rates, as all of you know. Since it takes 18 months for the most significant ones to take effect, since they are just being announced and taking effect now, the consequences will start to be felt in the economy about the time of the US presidential election in November of 2024, the end of 2024. And I think all of this adds up to, at the very least, a slowdown, if not a rise in unemployment.
Yeah, another point to note, and this is something that Glenn has already mentioned, is China slowdown. The cover story for The Economist this week is China slowdown. I think I have it here with me. It's right here. A beautiful cover, China slowdown with Xi walking. More to the point, China has grown dramatically over the past few years. They have lifted hundreds of millions, or the economic policymakers have lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. They've done quite well, but Xi Jinping's zero COVID campaign has failed. More than 200 million people are still living under restrictions and the economy is reeling. Xi's response seems to be another stimulus program, which is in the works. Yet, this time, it seems unlikely that cutting interest rates and spending more is unlikely to work. A big bond-financed government infrastructure program will only add to mountains of debt and piles of concrete. A real estate crash has been mentioned for months. We know of many Chinese real estate companies that have practically gone bust and are being propped up by the government. Chinese shares now trade at a 45% discount to American ones. This is a near record gap. The cost of capital, therefore, for Chinese businesses has risen. Thanks to cack-handed regulation, the incentives for the private sector have been damaged, which, by the way, is the most dynamic part of the Chinese economy. The Chinese have historically been great traders and great businessmen, but they are not helped by Xi's draconian government. And Xi's efforts to curb inequality, monopolies, and debt might all be laudable goals, and frankly are laudable goals. But ad hoc fines, sporadic purges, and poorly drafted regulations have hit the economy hard. I mean, the tech industry is a case in point. It contributes.
Sorry to jump in. I think they are laudable goals, but they also may be a lot of hooey. Those are they're nice words, but I think the primary motivation in Xi's moves is to consolidate power and destroy any rival power centers, rather than to bring justice to the peasants.
Well, yeah, and the tech industry about which I was speaking is 8% of the GDP, and it has been very dynamic and innovative, and it's stagnant now. The property sector is over 20% of the GDP. We've already talked about a crash in the real estate / property sector. And a crackdown has led to a funding crunch. In April, housing sales fell by 47% compared with a year earlier. And remember, the Chinese put their wealth first in property, even before they put it in shares. So that is, for most families, that is their repository of wealth. And the rebalancing of supply chains from China, away from China, has begun. Apparently, companies like Apple are reportedly moving to new locations. The Atlantic Council has spoken of a new type of global recession that could be driven by China. In the past, global recessions have been driven by the US or Germany. Now, of course, China is the 800-pound gorilla is one of the 800-pound gorilla in the global economy. It is a bigger economy than Germany. It is a bigger exporter than Germany. So, the Chinese impact on the global economy will be profound. And China has also provided financing for Sri Lanka, for African states, for China, for Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So if China slows down, enters a period of low growth or recession, then the old adage, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. That could apply as well today for China.
Oh, yeah, I think so. And the more I have learned about China, the more alarmed I have become about the economic prospects. I have been, everyone who has not been, frankly, awestruck by China's resurgence, return to its historic global position as the most populous and in some ways becoming the most powerful or influential country in the world. At the same time, Xi Jinping is clearly an extremely impressive leader. And yet, he, unfortunately, I think, believes what he's doing a bit too sincerely. He is the son, excuse me for a moment, he is the son of one of Mao's most loyal supporters, part of the Gang of Four faction, the left wing of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think he actually is sincere in his, he is seeking to consolidate power and eliminate any rival. And so an economically powerful person like Jack Ma or an institution are rivals, and unless they kowtow, they're a threat, and he will destroy them, which has long-term, significantly deleterious effects on the structure of the Chinese economy and Chinese growth rates. And he does believe, I think, in state control. I don't think he understands economics a whit. And he's progressively undoing many of the changes that have made China this powerhouse since 1979. Not entirely. He's not he's not trying to walk away from international trade at all or development, but he is centralizing in ways that will long-term lower the growth rate. At the same time, the debt problem in China it really is something terrifying, since a large proportion of Chinese savings are in real estate. And much of the real estate, Atul alluded to piles of concrete, literally it's almost a Ponzi scheme of apartment buildings at the size of a continent. They're unoccupied and operate at a loss if they operate at all. And there's been nowhere else to invest money. And it's been a way to provide unemployment and to deal with tremendous numbers of rural Chinese leaving the countryside. But it can't be sustained other than ultimately falsely by government bailouts, which you can sustain for a while until the central state itself becomes unsustainable economically. So I've become a pessimist about long-term prospects. And there's one other thing, and here I'm a determinist almost, is that for the last 5 years, I think already, every year, China's absolute number of the labor force declines. The population will continue to rise for a few more years, but the workforce is already in decline. And in the next 30 years, it will substantially decline. And there's nothing that can be done about that, short of a generation and forced childbirths. So all of these things are substantial weights on the likely global economic rate of growth.
And to that point, I think the global economy, I take a very pessimistic view. The global economy is bound to see the unraveling of the imbalances built over the years. In 2007, I wrote one of my first big pieces. This is when I was a corporate lawyer, when I was not running Fair Observer, and I wrote a piece titled "Mountains of Debt, Oceans of Reserves, the Yankee Doodle and Dragon Dance." And the gist of the argument was that America is consuming like no tomorrow, and of course China is producing like no tomorrow, and the world economy is imbalanced. And of course the financial crash followed, and the imbalances have not yet been unwound. People tried to kick the can down the road because they imagined there would be a depression, and there was a lot of bailouts. There were a lot of bailouts and quantitative easing, and then soon it was business as usual. And I'm afraid that the time is coming when business as usual will not work because the debt burden of, let's say, Southern Europe is unsustainable. Germany cannot bail France out, cannot even bail Italy out. Yes, you can bail out Greece. And similarly, there are $1 trillion+ of bad debts on, we don't even know actually exactly what is the amount of bad debts on the books of Chinese banks that are all in real estate, that have all gone to fund these Ponzi scheme-like companies that have been building flats and multi-story buildings and stadiums and whatnot. And that is unsustainable. And even in the U.S., the inflation hitting such a high mark, and people not having savings. Glenn remembers the figure, I presume, of what percentage of Americans have just $500, or that whole structure of the global economy. I think every few decades there's a moment of reckoning, and I'm afraid I take the pessimistic view that we are coming to that moment of reckoning, and we'll have to see fundamental structural changes.
But two points I'd like to add. I think they just complement or similar to what you were saying, or illustrated it off anyway. I would argue you have to put your finger on one problem in the U.S. economy, but frankly, in all economies, the U.S. historically, in many ways, tends to be 15 years ahead. Has been. It's less so now the case of other economies or societies politically. Now we're regressing, but that's another tale we'll talk about in a moment. Is the concentration of wealth. You can look throughout human history. We're not talking about just since the Industrial Revolution, but going back to the time of Han China and the Roman Empire. Concentration of wealth, when it reaches the levels, frankly, that we see now in the United States, where 1% of the population controls 80% of all capital, and 80% of the population controls something like 20%. 15%, I forget what the figures are, but anyway, it's grotesque. That makes it where most of the society, if they have a fender bender accident, falls into economic crisis. That cannot be sustained. And one might have a revolution or people marching on the Capitol to protest in an inchoate way this kind of injustice. At the same time, Xi is on the horns of a dilemma. He is sincere and believes in single party rule and in the primacy of the state in all aspects of life. In economics is an aspect of life. And any rival power center, is a threat and is unjust or wrong from his perspective. And so he is set out to destroy them. But he's so bright, I would have thought he could have overcome his doctrine, apparently not, to recognize that what Deng Xiaoping did by opening the economy, by creating this plurality of rival power centers and thought in all ways, is what is the motor of economic and social progress. But this is not how she sees things. So you have concentration of wealth, Ponzi schemes, and a concentration of power, first in the US in particular, the second in China, and I am pessimistic.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if China oscillates. They had Mao was the first modern emperor after a period of chaos. And the Great Leap Forward was a grand disaster. And that, as if that wasn't enough, that was followed by the Cultural Revolution, which eviscerated the intelligentsia and the middle class and the technical talent. And then, of course, Deng, whom Lee Kuan Yew, the late Singaporean prime minister, found the most remarkable leader of the 20th century, and he perhaps was. Deng revalued his, another bright man, but a man who could change his mind. He revalued his assumptions and beliefs and said, maybe this doesn't work. He opened up, and his legendary words, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. And in 1992, he doubled down. Remember, in 1991, the Soviet Union fell. And there was a big debate in the Communist Party, in the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. And Deng went on Nangshun, the southern tour. And he doubled down on reform. He doubled down on opening up further. China eventually entered the World Trade Organization. China became the workshop of the world. And in a way, China's strength was built on Deng's reforms. And yes, it led to a certain concentration of wealth. Yes, it led to a really bare-knuckled, red-in-the-tooth and claw form of capitalism. And yes, there were tensions, especially in recent years. But now the son of a Maoist has come back and brought back Mao. It is as if the pendulum has swung from Mao to Deng and is now swinging back to Mao again. This man is president for life or emperor for life. I mean, he's head of every important institution. He's undercut, as we covered in one of the articles, he's undercut the only possible rival he could have. She, in a way, is is a big threat, not just to the Chinese economic outlook, but the global economic outlook. So combine the concentration of wealth in the US and combine that with the concentration of power in China, and problems of debt in sub-Saharan Africa, or the problems of Latin America, or now problems not just in Southern Europe, but in the heart of the economic beast of Europe, which is Germany, which is basically the engine that keeps the EU economy pumping. And the global picture is not extremely salubrious.
Yeah, I think we can summarize and say inflation can be controlled, and I think will be. I don't think it need be structural. I mean, right now you have Ukraine and the supply side issues from COVID and the war affecting it, but measures will work, but that will exact a cost, and growth will, at the least, in globally, certainly in the US and Western Europe, and thus elsewhere, and China will slow. I don't think it's determined that there will be a global recession, but generally, when you fight inflation, you raise rates, and that causes a recession.
Brilliant. And we move on. Any questions, anyone? Any thoughts on, Stephen Ellman has a question. Any thoughts of on why this inflation has occurred only now? QE increased money supply, and inflation was conspicuously low. Stephen, I'll take that question, and Glenn can add. I think part of the reason inflation has been low since 1991 is because you had a massive influx of labor into the global labor pool. So you had the Chinese, even the Indians, of course, the whole of Southeast Asia, doubling down on this new globalized free market economy. So the inflation rate, which let's say was pegged at 2% for Europe and the US, meant that actually the natural rate of inflation, Nairu is an non-accelerating inflation rate. I'm forgetting which we read back in the day, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. That actually probably came down because of this huge increase in labor supply, and the cost of labor went down dramatically, which is why factories shipped out to China or to Vietnam or initially to Mexico, which Ross Perot talked about back in the election of 1992, and the giant sucking sound. And inflation rate wasn't affected even by quantitative easing, because there was still production in China, cheap production in China. China kept providing easy credit. The developing world kept costs down. It didn't show up in Walmart. It didn't show up on Amazon. But inflation, and this is what I argued, and many of the economists in the US government argued off the record. They didn't say it on the record. They argued that it wasn't showing up in commodities, but it was showing up in asset price bubbles. The cost of real estate, the cost of shares. I mean, share prices went up to record highs. So now what has happened is that there's been a supply side shock. And so the supply side, which had expanded after 1991, suddenly faces a squeeze, not just from Russia, but also from China. The zero to COVID policy and 200 million under restrictions mean that production is not as cheap as it was. And the spiral effect, I mean, these things go in spirals up and down. And the spiral effect, which we saw going up, is now on the way down. So I hope that answers your question.
I give a really simple answer, which, I mean, the issue is not simple, but this is a simple answer. a reductive one. But I think an important one too is globalization. The world has been globalized for probably millennia. I mean, I think we flatter ourselves by thinking we live in the first globalized world, but nonetheless, globalization as we generally understand it really exploded, took off 40 years ago, perhaps 50 at the most, roughly coinciding with the end of the Cold War and about that. And so Western advanced economies have all benefited from low-cost goods produced by low-wage labor in what was the third world and has now become, in many places, also the developed world, advanced economies. And that's kept prices down. It also explains the next topic we're going to talk about, and Atul touched upon it with his reminding us all about the great Ross Perot and his campaign slogan about the giant sucking sound, taking American jobs away and shipping them off to Vietnam and Taiwan.
Mexico, he said Mexico.
Oh, Mexico. Okay. Well, okay, Mexico.
NAFTA was then in play, remember? And George Bush Senior, and others were discussing NAFTA, and he was against NAFTA.
NAFTA, yes. So I worked on NAFTA. I'm a huge NAFTA proponent, but as anyone sensible should be on the whole. However, the giant sucking sound comment and issue is what we're dealing with now. It's not just an economic one. The benefits are low inflation and low cost, amazing diversity of goods, economic development, huge benefits on the whole globally for vast majority of the world's population. Fewer people now live at subsistence level, and more people have access to clean water. I mean, all by every index, life has improved in a macro level globally in the last 70 years, but particularly 40. But the consequences have been this rapid change and export of economic control and status by the hitherto, up until now, dominant groups in the United States. That means white males, in particular rural white males who had working class jobs. And the giant sucking sound leads us to the problems of democracy and in the US and France, and it's a global sociological phenomenon.
And to very quickly jump in, whilst in aggregate, say, poverty is much lesser than it was in the past. People on average have better nutrition. People on average are living longer. People are taller around the world on aggregate. But at the same time, there have been winners and losers. And in the advanced economies, workers have lost out because capital, if you, let's say, you are a billionaire, you're Elon Musk, or you are Jeff Bezos, you can plonk your capital in China, and if costs in China increase, you can plonk it to Vietnam. And the regulatory standards are lower. There's less environmental regulation, as let's say in Germany, where they really like keeping their waters and rivers clean. You're in China, and most of the groundwater, most of the surface water is polluted. So your cost of production is lower, not just in terms of labor, which is of course true, but also in terms of environmental, the new fashion ESG, as people talk about, environmental, social, and governance factors. I mean, all those factors really, you can bid them adieu when you go to a third world country. They need the money, they need the jobs. And so there have been losers, and the working class has lost out because the working class had to compete with the working class in China, let's say, for jobs and call centers in India for service jobs. So both manufacturing and service.
Impossible for them to compete. And that's exactly the point. I absolutely agree. I recently had an inadvertent social canvassing that I conducted in America. I haven't traveled like so many for 2.5 years because of the pandemic, but recently I had occasion, I had business in Tucson, Arizona, and then I had business in Washington, D.C., in New York City, and then just a couple of days ago, I went to Vancouver in British Columbia. And the same phenomenon struck me in each place. I took the train. Amtrak is a wonderful train. Don't let people malign it. And I stepped out of Union Station, which is also magnificent, in the magnificent U.S. Capitol. It truly is quite a magnificent place. And I was confronted as I stepped out of the train station by a literal tent city of homeless people. In New York, I walked past what I believe was a dead body on the side, in the gutter, as I walked to the train station. There were homeless people everywhere. In Vancouver, which is a very progressive city, there is, and I've been there over many years, there is now, far more than ever before, a large tent city of homeless people in the eastern part of downtown. Similarly, in Boston, where there have always been homeless in certain neighborhoods, there are exponentially more people there. My daughter lives in San Francisco, or just outside of San Francisco, and she's no wilting wallflower or particular crusader, but she is aware and objective. And she hesitates now to go into San Francisco because of the huge number of homeless people in tent cities sort of roaming around. This is a terrifying phenomena. These are the victims of many specific causes. The fentanyl and opioid issue is certainly a huge part of that. But the social stresses from globalization, the losers that Atul touched upon, we all know. Well, maybe none of us know firsthand, because I presume all of us are probably similar to me, as a privileged person who isn't living under a bridge by necessity. This is tearing the fabric of advanced societies apart. The social stresses which come from economic concentration of wealth and loss of jobs for working class people. And that explains why we were having January 6 hearings. That explains, frankly, not the entire, a large part of the Trump phenomena, the American fascist phenomena. The other one is sort of America's original sin, which is the fundamental structural, that's a politically laden term, and I don't want to say something that is really not controversial, because it's a fact. The essential nature of the racial clash and of racism, the black-white divide, and now multi-ethnic divide with whites, because we've finally become a multi-ethnic society, that has shaped so much of American history, is a defining part of American history, that we struggle to come to terms with. And with economic stress on top of these enduring racial strains, you have the Capitol assaulted. Similarly, and then I'll let Atul, correct me and speak from there. France hasn't quite had a march on the Bastille a second time, but I would argue that the social political strains in France are from fundamentally the same phenomena. France has in some ways a more rigid political system. It's more centralized, and so it's more subject to fracture than the U.S. system has been. But I think the socioeconomic strains are the fundamental issue that are roiling all of our lives and making American democracy a question mark now, which is shocking to anyone over the last 180 years or 200 years, and which are straining the Fifth Republic in France. That's the thumbnail.
Yeah, on when it comes to democracy, I think our first podcast, those of you who have not heard it, I'd recommend you download it either on Spotify or Apple or Google or any other place. And we talk about democracy. I think in democracy, you always have the risk of a society splintering into identity politics and interest groups. It was a risk that the Greeks suffered as the Greek Athenian democracy didn't survive the Peloponnesian War. The Romans, of course, the Roman democracy had become one where form trumped substance, and Julius Caesar eventually, one could argue, brought in effective governance through a brutal but a new imperial system. And in France, which has already had the Fifth Republic, and the Fifth Republic was created in the image of Charles de Gaulle, a powerful presidency, but then of course they have a parliamentary system too. So in a way, the French Fifth Republic is neither fish nor fowl. And the ability to govern has become difficult because on the one hand you have Macron who disintermediated the existing political parties to come up, and now of course you have new political parties. The traditional parties are gone, and Peter has examined this phenomenon very well, and the current reality of France is that people voted against Le Pen. They didn't vote for Macron, and even the first time around. And now he has a hung parliament. He got a mandate the first time around, but now he has a hung parliament, and he won't be able to get any of his agenda across. And France doesn't know which direction it has got to go to. And democracy needs that balance of yes, diversity of ideas and opinions, but also some kind of social cohesion, which Ibn Khaldun called Asabia, the 14th century Islamic philosopher of North Africa. And that is a threat, whether it is France or whether it is the US. In the US as well, it is, identity politics has come up, and interest groups have become very powerful because most people vote as per television campaigns and social media campaigns, and they cost money. So it is very easy for interest groups with a lot of cash to skew the narrative. And what we are seeing is a real crisis because after the midterms, the US may be in a similar situation to France, with the US Congress and the executive at loggerheads.
Yeah, it's not a happy near-term future, certainly. Biden was completely right when he said that the issues that he is trying to represent or struggle against is the battle for the soul of American democracy. The January 6 hearings are devastating, but will convince none of the Trump true believers, none. I continue to receive emails from former classmates, lifelong friends, who are at least formally highly educated, who taunt me because I am critical of Donald Trump and ask me when I will publicly, because I was an early public critic of Trump for many things, notably that he's a traitor and a spy for Russia, when I will publicly apologize for having so maligned America's savior. So we're dealing with a matter of faith here, not of reason, but they are certainly devastating for the 70% of people who are at least periodically rational.
And that brings the point onto culture, and culture matters. And I think what has happened over many years, is a decline in culture around the world, and a decline in critical thinking. I think anything can go to excess, and when market forces go to excess, just as when Xi's communistic forces go to excess, you have a disequilibrium. And at this point, I'll take the last question and then we'll sign off. Someone has asked, an anonymous attendee has asked, will any countries or businesses find silver linings in global economic problems? And the answer is, of course. There are always opportunities in crises. And I think the businesses and countries that produce things that are needed, that improve the education and the living standards of their people as a whole, not just the top 1%, and that have a marketplace that is not oligopolistic but is competitive, where your options are not just the state-controlled coffee shop as in the Soviet Union, or the chains by Starbucks, where you have the little guy doesn't have to be an employee of a big corporation or the state, where you have an entrepreneurial society with a sense of community. Those are the countries that'll do well.
Short, medium term, the beneficiaries are the petroleum producing,
yes,
fossil fuel producing states, and agricultural exporters, of whom there are a few, which haven't been invaded by Russia.
I mean, the US and Canada will do well with their grain exports. The
US is the largest producer of oil in the world, I think, and is a net exporter if we wish to be. So the short, medium term, they will benefit.
And in India will be a place of growth, because a lot of capital coming out of China might want to redeploy in a size and scale of a market such as India, and India has not had the same supply shock, partly because of buying Russian oil. So that is another country that might do well.
And on those happy notes.
Exactly. It was great having all of you here, and we will see you next month. All the best, and bye for now.